My name is Nora Robinson. I am 70 years old today, but the story I'm about to share with you happened many years ago when I was 24. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and it was the day my younger sister Madison made the biggest mistake of her life. She accidentally added me to a group chat titled Real Family. Before she realized what she did and tried to kick me out, my phone synced the chat history. 5 years of history loaded onto my screen in an instant. I sat in the front office of my native plant nursery in Boise, Idaho, and stared at my device. I scrolled through 95 unread messages. Every single one of them was about me. I saw my mother, Beverly, sending photos of my modest car parked outside her house with a sick emoji. I saw my father, Richard, placing literal cash bets with Madison on which month I would come crawling to them for a loan. They called me the charity case. They assumed I was destitute because I worked in the dirt wearing flannel and work boots instead of country club attire. The hardest part to read was the messages from 5 years earlier when I was just 19. I scrolled back to the exact week my ex-husband David walked out on me. I was devastated back then. I remembered calling my mother crying on the floor of my empty apartment. In the group chat, the story was different. Madison had sent a text saying the dead weight is finally gone. My mother replied saying Nora never had the ambition to keep a good man anyway. My father added a joke about how I would probably move into their basement by Christmas. They celebrated my young divorce while I was grieving. For 5 years, my parents and my sister used this private space to tear apart every aspect of my life. At 24 years old, I probably should have cried, but I did not cry. I did not call them screaming or demanding an apology. Anger is a hot emotion, but what I felt right then was freezing cold. I sat at my wooden desk smelling the scent of damp earth and pine from the greenhouses outside. I spent 20 minutes taking meticulous screenshots of every conversation. I made sure every timestamp and every phone number was clearly visible on the screen. I saved the entire archive to a secure backup drive. Once the evidence was safe, I opened the group chat keyboard. I typed a single reply. "Thanks for the evidence." I pressed send. Then I blocked Richard, Beverly, and Madison across every platform. Before I tell you what a 24-year-old woman did with those screenshots at her grandmother's 80th birthday gala, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Have you ever discovered exactly what people think of you when you are not in the room? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments. Now let an old woman take you back to the beginning so you can understand why my family thought I was a failure and why they were so very wrong. I blocked them on my phone, but my laptop was still open on my desk. Less than 2 minutes after I sent that final message, the email notifications started. A cascade of digital panic pinged across my screen. Madison sent 7 emails in the span of 12 minutes. The subject lines shifted from confused to furious to desperate. "Nora, what is wrong with you? Call me right now. You are overreacting. It was an inside joke. You are taking everything out of context." I sat back in my chair and watched the notifications stack up. An inside joke. A 5-year campaign of cruel bets and calculated insults, and my sister wanted to file it under family banter. I did not open a single email. I dragged the entire thread directly into the trash folder. The silence that followed was the most peaceful sound I had heard in half a decade. For years, I had allowed their voices to dictate my worth. I had allowed them to write the narrative of my life. Sitting in my office, smelling the damp earth and cedar from my greenhouses, I finally had the quiet space to examine how we got here. It all started 5 years ago, the week my marriage fractured. When David packed his bags and drove away, I thought I could turn to my family for a soft place to land. I drove to my parents' house in the Boise foothills seeking comfort. I stood in their pristine living room with tears streaming down my face, waiting for my mother to hold me. Instead, Beverly stood on the other side of the marble kitchen island, crossing her arms. She did not offer a tissue. She offered a diagnosis. She told me David was a driven man who needed a wife with ambition, a partner who could host dinner parties and elevate his status. She looked at my faded jeans and tired eyes and sighed. She said I could not expect a man like that to stay when I refused to level up. She told me I simply did not try hard enough to keep him. My father, Richard, sat in his leather armchair reading a financial magazine. He did not look up from the page. He just muttered that divorce was an expensive embarrassment. He told me I needed to figure out my next steps quickly so I would not become a drain on his retirement accounts. In my deepest moment of grief, they did not see a daughter in pain. They saw a liability. That was the exact moment the family hierarchy shifted from subtle preference to official law. They needed a success story to parade around their social circles, and Madison was more than happy to fill the vacancy. Madison is 4 years younger than me and built her entire personality around acquiring status. She had recently earned her real estate license and married Brody. Brody was a slick local developer who drove a leased sports car and talked endlessly about his golf handicap. Together, they were the perfect shiny objects for my parents to focus on. Richard and Beverly immediately pivoted all their emotional and financial investments toward Madison. They helped with the down payment on Brody and Madison's 6,000 square foot modern farmhouse. They funded Madison's flashy marketing campaigns. They bought tables at charity galas just so Madison could be photographed wearing designer gowns next to local politicians. Madison became the golden child, the undeniable proof that the Robinson family bred winners. For Madison to be the winner, they needed a loser to contrast her against. That was my assigned role. I became the charity case. To protect Madison's rising social profile in Idaho's elite circles, my parents decided I needed to be managed, minimized, and hidden away. It did not happen all at once. It was a slow, deliberate erasure. I stopped receiving invitations to the country club Sunday brunches. When I asked why Beverly claimed the reservations were too difficult to change or that the conversations would bore me since I was not in the corporate world. Then they stopped consulting me on family decisions. When my father sold the lake cabin, where we spent our childhood summers, I found out through a social media post Madison made about the closing. When I called my father to ask why he had not even mentioned it, he brushed me off. He said Madison and Brody handled the real estate transaction because they understood the market, and there was no reason to bother me with high-level financial details I would not grasp. Holidays became an exercise in endurance. During Thanksgiving dinner at Madison's sprawling house, I was seated at the far end of the long dining table, wedged next to the swinging kitchen door. Throughout the evening, Richard would loudly ask Brody about his investment yields and praise Madison's latest property listings. Whenever the conversation drifted toward me, the tone would shift to forced pity. My mother would lean across the table, offering a tight, patronizing smile, and ask if I was still playing around with my little gardening hobby. Before I could even answer, Madison would chime in, reminding everyone that honest manual labor builds character even if it does not build wealth. They treated my presence like a burden they were gracefully tolerating. Brody treated me the way a wealthy man treats a valet who scratches his bumper. During a 4th of July barbecue, I watched Brody hold court on the patio, holding a craft beer. He saw me approaching the cooler and raised his voice just enough so the other guests could hear. He asked me if I wanted him to connect me with his landscaping crew, suggesting they might have an entry-level position open for someone who likes digging in the dirt. Madison giggled and wrapped her arm around his waist, telling him to leave me alone, calling me a free spirit who could not handle real employment. My parents stood 3 feet away. They heard every word. Richard just took a sip of his bourbon, and Beverly adjusted her sunglasses. Neither of them defended me. I walked away without a drink. I used to think these slights were accidental. I used to excuse their behavior, telling myself they were just tactless or overly focused on Madison's fast-paced life. Reading those 95 messages cured me of that illusion. The group chat proved that the hierarchy was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, calculated structure. Keeping me in the shadows was the only way they could make Madison shine so brightly. They bonded over my perceived failures. Mocking me was the glue that held their perfect image together. I looked back at my laptop screen. The barrage of emails had finally stopped. The final email from Madison sat at the top of the inbox. The subject line read simply, "We need to talk." The body of the email contained no apologies. It was a demand. She wrote that she and our parents were coming to my nursery tomorrow morning to clear the air. She said they needed to fix this before Grandma Beatrice's birthday gala this weekend because they could not afford any family drama ruining the event. They were coming to my territory. For 5 years, I had walked into their pristine homes and allowed them to make me feel small. Now they were driving out to my facility. They thought they were coming to scold a weak, destitute woman who would quietly accept their excuses. They had no idea what was waiting for them. They thought they were driving out to a hobby garden. They assumed they would find me potting a few petunias in a dilapidated shed, holding a trowel and crying over their text messages. They had no idea what Idaho native roots actually was because they had never bothered to ask. When the sun rose the next morning, I walked out of my front office and looked across my property. 50 acres of prime agricultural zoning stretched out toward the foothills. 3 state-of-the-art climate-controlled greenhouses stood in a row, their glass panes catching the early morning light. A fleet of 6 commercial flatbed trucks sat parked near the loading bays, waiting for my crew to arrive. I owned every single inch of this facility, free and clear. After my divorce, I did not wallow. I took the small settlement I received and my entire life savings and poured it into the dirt. I spent the first 2 years digging irrigation lines by hand and learning the exact soil chemistry needed to revive indigenous plant species. I wore out pairs of heavy work boots and stained every flannel shirt I owned. My family took one look at my calloused hands and decided I was a failure. They equated success with leased sports cars and heavily mortgaged square footage. They needed to see designer labels to validate a person's worth. They never looked beneath the surface. If my father had bothered to search the public state vendor registry, he would have discovered the truth. Last Thursday, the State Environmental Commission finalized our bid. Idaho Native Roots secured a $6 million municipal contract to restore 70 miles of damaged riverfront habitat along the Snake River. We beat out 3 corporate engineering firms for the job. My profit margins for the upcoming fiscal year were projected to dwarf Brody's speculative real estate ventures. But I kept my mouth shut. I let them call me the charity case because their ignorance was my shield. Working in the dirt gave me peace, and staying off their radar allowed me to build my empire without their interference. I was reviewing the loading schedule on my clipboard when I heard tires crunching on the gravel driveway. It was too early for my foreman to arrive, and the engine sounded too smooth for a delivery truck. I stepped out of the greenhouse and watched a vintage, pristine 1980 Mercedes-Benz roll to a stop near my office. The driver's side door opened and Grandma Beatrice stepped out. Beatrice was 80 years old and the undisputed matriarch of the Robinson family. She represented old money Idaho. She wore a tailored wool coat and silk scarf, standing with a posture that demanded immediate respect. She carried a structured leather handbag that held no visible designer logos because Beatrice did not need to advertise her wealth. She built the original family fortune alongside my grandfather decades ago, dealing in timber and commercial land. My father, Richard, simply inherited the dividends and focused on climbing the country club social ladder. Beatrice leaned on her silver-handled cane and looked around the property. She took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, smelling the damp cedar and blooming sagebrush. "You need to expand the southern irrigation zone, Nora," she said without saying hello. "Those saplings are going to need more water when the July heat hits." I smiled and walked over to her. "I already ordered the extra piping, Grandma. It gets installed next Tuesday." Beatrice nodded, her eyes sharp and assessing. She was the only person in my family who knew exactly what I was building. When David left me 5 years ago, Beatrice did not offer me pity or tell me to change my wardrobe to find another husband. She invited me to her study, poured me a cup of black tea, and taught me how to structure a limited liability company. She reviewed my initial business plans. She showed me how to read commercial balance sheets and negotiate supply chain contracts. She was my secret mentor. Beatrice respected sweat equity, and she despised the superficial facade my parents and sister had constructed. She walked past me into the front office, navigating the dirt floor in her expensive leather loafers without hesitation. She sat down in the wooden chair opposite my desk and rested her hands on her cane. "Your father called me this morning," Beatrice said. Her voice was calm but carried a razor-sharp edge. "He was breathing so fast I thought he was having a cardiac event. Madison apparently woke him up at dawn screaming about a group chat." I leaned against my desk and crossed my arms. "So they told you what happened?" "They told me a highly sanitized version," Beatrice replied. "Richard claimed there was a minor miscommunication and that you were taking some playful family banter out of context. He said he was coming out here today to smooth things over before my birthday party so you would not cause a scene." I looked at the floor. "It was not banter, Grandma. I have screenshots of 95 messages. They placed bets on my financial ruin. They laughed about my divorce the week it happened." "I know," Beatrice said softly. Her sharp eyes softened for just a fraction of a second. I know exactly what they are, Nora. I have watched Richard coddle that foolish sister of yours for years while treating you like a nuisance. I watched them build their little house of cards. I just needed you to finally see it. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. The flap was sealed with gold wax and embossed with the Silverhawk Country Club logo. She placed it on my desk. My 80th birthday gala is this Saturday, Beatrice stated. 200 guests. The mayor is coming. Half the city council will be there. Brody has invited a dozen of his prospective real estate investors, hoping to use my name to secure funding for his over-leveraged firm. Richard is planning to give a toast to our perfect united family. I stared at the invitation. I do not think I should go, Grandma. If I walk into that room, I might burn it down. Beatrice leaned forward and tapped her cane against the floorboards. A sharp, authoritative crack. That is exactly why you are going. I looked up at her, surprised by the cold intensity in her voice. You have spent 5 years letting them write your story, Beatrice said. You let them hide you in the corner at Thanksgiving. You let Brody insult your business. You stayed quiet because you thought it was the noble thing to do. But silence is not nobility, Nora. Sometimes silence is just permission. She stood up, adjusting her silk scarf. Richard and Beverly will be here soon. They are going to try to manage you. They are going to offer you some pathetic olive branch to keep you quiet for Saturday. Take it. Let them think they won. Let them walk into that ballroom on Saturday, believing they still hold all the cards. I touched the heavy cardstock of the invitation. What happens on Saturday? Beatrice offered a smile that held zero warmth. It was the smile of a predator watching a trap spring shut. It is time to let them dig their own graves, Nora, and I am going to hand them the shovels. She turned and walked out of the office. I stood in the doorway and watched her vintage Mercedes disappear down the long gravel road, heading back toward the city limits. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the low fog over the greenhouses. My crew began arriving, parking their pickup trucks by the loading bays. The day was starting. I walked back to my desk and picked up the invitation. The gold foil caught the light. For years, the Silverhawk Country Club had been the symbol of everything my family valued. It was a place of exclusion, of rigid social hierarchies and fake smiles. They had kept me out of those rooms deliberately, ensuring I never embarrassed Madison in front of her elite friends. Now the matriarch of the family had just handed me a master key. I placed the invitation in my top drawer and locked it. I pulled out my ledger and began reviewing the supply orders for the state contract. I had a business to run, and I refused to let their panic disrupt my profit margins. 2 hours later, the peace of the nursery shattered. A pristine silver Lexus SUV turned off the main highway and began creeping down my driveway. The driver swerved erratically to avoid the minor potholes, acting as if the mud might permanently infect the undercarriage. The vehicle rolled to a stop next to my loading bays, blocking a forklift. The engine cut off. The driver's side door opened and my father stepped out, wearing a tailored golf shirt and pressed khakis. My mother emerged from the passenger side, wearing designer sunglasses and holding a leather handbag tightly against her chest, as if she were walking through a dangerous neighborhood. They stood in the dirt, looking at my greenhouses with an expression of profound distaste. They had arrived for their intervention. They had brought their checkbook. My parents walked into my office as if they were stepping into a biohazard zone. Richard brushed a speck of invisible dust from his sleeve, while Beverly held a scented tissue near her nose, masking the smell of the damp earth and fertilizer. They did not look at the blueprints on my desk or the massive whiteboard detailing the state municipal contract logistics. They only saw what they wanted to see. A rundown shed belonging to a daughter who was failing at life. Richard cleared his throat and adjusted his Rolex. He stood in front of my desk, attempting to project the kind of corporate dominance he used in boardrooms. Nora, we need to have a mature conversation, he began. His voice carried that familiar patronizing tone reserved for unruly children and incompetent employees. Your sister is very upset. You blocking everyone was a massive overreaction. I stayed seated behind my wooden desk. I did not offer them chairs. I folded my hands over the state contract file resting on the blotter. I am listening, I said. My voice was entirely flat, offering zero emotional leverage. Beverly stepped forward, placing her manicured hands on the edge of the desk. Sweetheart, you have to understand that families vent. Everyone needs a private space to blow off steam. The things we said were not meant to be cruel. We were just concerned about you. I looked at my mother, the woman who laughed about my divorce 5 years ago. The woman who placed bets on my bankruptcy was now trying to rebrand her cruelty as maternal concern. I did not blink. You were concerned, I repeated. That is why Madison bet $50 I would ask for a loan by November. Because you were worried. Richard shifted his weight, running a hand through his thinning silver hair. He hated being confronted with documented facts. It is just dark humor, Nora. You have always been so sensitive. We came all the way out here to this. He waved his hand dismissively around the room to this place to clear the air. We cannot have you acting out this weekend. The real motive surfaced. It was never about mending fences or repairing a broken relationship. It was about Saturday. My father was a man obsessed with appearances because appearances were all he had left. For years, he had coasted on the dividends from Grandma Beatrice's original investments. He loved to play the role of the successful patriarch at the Silverhawk Country Club, but his actual business acumen was hollow. He had made a string of terrible commercial investments over the last decade, and his personal wealth was slowly draining away. The birthday gala was not just a celebration for his mother, it was a desperate networking opportunity. He needed to impress Brody's high net worth real estate contacts to secure a position on a new development board. A public family scandal was the one thing he could not afford. Grandma's birthday is a major event, Richard continued, his tone tightening. The mayor is attending. Several key investors from Denver are flying in. I will not have you causing a scene or making Madison uncomfortable in front of Brody's colleagues. I kept my expression neutral. What makes you think I would cause a scene? Because you are hurt, Beverly interjected quickly. Her voice dripped with manufactured sympathy. And hurt people lash out. We just want to make sure you feel included and presentable. She opened her designer handbag and pulled out a checkbook. She clicked a gold pen and scribbled across the paper with deliberate, slow strokes. She tore the check from the binding and slid it across the wooden desk toward me. It was a check for $1,000. Buy yourself a nice dress, Nora Beverly said. Something elegant. Something that fits. We do not want you showing up looking like a charity case in front of important people. Consider it an early birthday present. I looked down at the slip of paper. $1,000. A bribe disguised as a gift. They were trying to pay me off to ensure my silence. They thought my pride could be bought for the price of a mid-range cocktail dress. They assumed I was so desperate for cash that I would swallow my dignity and comply. In the past, I might have thrown the check back in their faces. I might have screamed that I did not need their dirty money. I might have kicked them out of my office and demanded they never return. But anger is predictable. Anger gives the opponent a target. Grandma Beatrice's words echoed in my mind. Let them think they won. I slowly reached out and picked up the check. I held it between my fingers, feeling the texture of the paper. I did not tear it up. I folded it precisely in half and then in half again. I slipped the folded square into the front pocket of my flannel shirt. I looked back up at my parents. Their shoulders visibly relaxed. They exchanged a quick, triumphant glance. The transaction was complete. The unruly daughter had been managed. Thank you, I said quietly. I will buy a dress. Richard let out a long breath, the tension leaving his jaw. Good. That is all we ask, Nora. Just come to the country club, sit quietly, and do not stir up any drama about this group chat nonsense. Can you promise me that? I promise I will not start any drama, I said. The words tasted like ash, but I kept my delivery perfectly smooth. Beverly beamed a tight, artificial smile. See, Richard, I told you she would listen to reason. We will see you on Saturday, Nora. 7 o'clock sharp. Try not to be late. They turned and walked out of the office, their designer shoes crunching against the gravel. I watched them climb back into their pristine SUV and drive away, eager to return to their manicured reality. They drove away believing they had secured their perfect evening. They thought the check was a leash. They had no idea it was a receipt. I pulled the folded check out of my pocket and placed it on top of the state contract file. The irony was suffocating. My father was terrified of me embarrassing him in front of Brody's investors. He was relying on Brody to save his fading financial reputation. What Richard did not realize was that Brody was the last person who could save anyone. The flashy developer with the leased sports car and the expensive golf habit was drowning in a crisis much larger than my father's. Brody and Madison were living inside a house of cards that was rapidly running out of oxygen. They needed a miracle to survive the next quarter. They needed a specific, massive piece of land to build their next luxury subdivision. They had been bragging about this upcoming deal for months in the Real Family group chat. They thought securing this land would make them Idaho royalty. They had no idea who actually held the deed. The $1,000 check sat on my desk, acting as a paperweight for my state contract file. My father drove away from my nursery, believing he had successfully contained a threat. He believed he bought my silence to protect his reputation and to protect Brody. But Brody was not a financial titan who needed protecting from family gossip. Brody was a man treading water in a stormy ocean with a cinder block tied to his ankles. If you looked at Madison and Brody through the lens of social media, they were the picture of modern Idaho success. Madison posted daily updates from her pristine 6,000 square foot modern farmhouse. She filmed herself drinking expensive matcha lattes in a kitchen featuring imported marble countertops. Brody frequently appeared in the background, wearing tailored suits and taking very important phone calls next to his silver sports car. They cultivated an aesthetic of effortless wealth. The reality hidden behind those digital filters was a crumbling foundation of debt. I knew how to read financial markets, and I understood local real estate trends better than my sister realized. Brody did not own his development firm outright. He was drowning in high-yield loans and adjustable-rate mortgages. His business model relied on flipping suburban lots as quickly as possible to outrun his interest payments. When the local housing market experienced a slight cooling trend, his cash flow evaporated. Their modern farmhouse carried 2 mortgages. The silver sports car was leased. They were living paycheck to paycheck on a millionaire scale, sweating through every billing cycle. They needed a miracle to survive the next quarter. Brody needed a whale of a deal to bail out his sinking firm and pacify his frantic creditors. That miracle had a name. It was called the Old Creek Tract. The Old Creek Tract was the crown jewel of undeveloped land in our region. 500 pristine acres located just past the city limits, bordering a winding stretch of cold, clear river water. It featured dense pine forests, rolling natural meadows, and a thriving indigenous ecosystem. It was the last large, untouched parcel of land in the area. Brody staked his entire future on acquiring that specific property. He spent the last 8 months courting private equity groups, trying to cobble together enough capital to buy the tract. His vision for the land was clinical and destructive. He planned to bulldoze the historic timber pave over the wild meadows and grid the earth into 100 cookie-cutter luxury lots. He wanted to build an exclusive gated community and name it after himself. Selling those lots was the only mathematical way he could pay off his mounting debts and maintain Madison's lavish lifestyle. Madison believed the deal was a guaranteed certainty. While taking screenshots of the Real Family group chat, I read the messages where she bragged endlessly about this acquisition. Her texts from 2 months ago were dripping with unearned arrogance. She told our parents that Brody was finalizing the paperwork with a holding company and that they were about to become Idaho royalty. She could not resist using her imagined future wealth as a weapon against me. One of the messages I saved read, "Brody is going to clear $8 million on the Old Creek subdivision alone. Tell the gardener she can come water my new lawn when we move into the model estate. She might learn a thing or two about real success." My mother replied to that text with 3 laughing emojis. They celebrated millions of dollars they did not actually have. They gloated over a piece of land they did not yet own. And they missed the deep, painful irony of targeting that specific acreage. The Old Creek Tract was not just random geography. It held a dark, specific history for my family. 80 years ago, that exact acreage belonged to my great-grandfather. It was the original foundation of the Robinson family legacy. It was supposed to remain in our bloodline forever. When my father Richard turned 35, Grandma Beatrice handed him the management reins of the family portfolio. She trusted her son to protect their heritage. Richard failed. He leveraged the Old Creek land to fund a highly speculative commercial venture that went bankrupt within 2 years. The bank foreclosed on the 500 acres. Beatrice had to sit in a sterile legal office and watch her ancestral land auctioned off to a faceless holding company. She never forgave Richard for his reckless arrogance. My father lived his entire adult life carrying the shame of losing Old Creek. That lingering guilt was the true reason he supported Brody so fiercely. Richard looked at Brody and saw a younger version of himself. He believed that if he could help his son-in-law acquire the Old Creek tract and turn it into a profitable subdivision, it would somehow erase his past failures. He thought it would redeem him in the eyes of his mother. Brody knew the family history. He knew how much it hurt Beatrice to lose those pine trees and riverbanks. Yet his plan was to buy the land, destroy the natural beauty Beatrice loved, and stamp his own name on the gates. He thought it established him as the new alpha of the family, proving he could succeed where Richard had failed. Beatrice played the role of the stoic matriarch. When Brody bragged about his development plans at holiday dinners, she would just sip her tea and nod politely. She feigned total indifference. But I knew my grandmother. I sat in her study for years learning how she operated. She despised Brody for trying to pave over her heritage. She despised Richard for cheering him on. This deep, toxic web of debt and history was the invisible current dragging them all toward Saturday night. The 80th birthday gala at the Silverhawk Country Club was never just a party. It was a desperate pitch meeting masquerading as a celebration. Brody was running out of time to secure his funding for the land purchase. The Denver investors attending the gala were his final hope. He needed to stand in front of that ballroom project, total financial dominance, and convince those men to hand him the capital to buy Old Creek. Richard needed to deliver a toast, showcasing our flawless family unity, to assure the investors that Brody was backed by old Idaho money. Madison needed to wear a designer gown and smile for the cameras, securing her status at the top of the social hierarchy. They were banking their entire existence on a flawless performance. They constructed a perfect, beautiful glass house built entirely on secret lies and unpaid invoices. My parents thought they protected that glass house by driving out to my nursery and handing me a check for $1,000. They thought telling me to sit quietly in the corner would keep their fragile world from shattering. They assumed they held all the leverage because they judged my worth by the dirt on my boots. They failed to ask the most important question in real estate. They never bothered to find out who actually owned the holding company that currently held the deed to the Old Creek tract. I locked my office door and walked out to my truck. I needed to go shopping. My mother told me to buy a nice dress so I would not look out of place among their elite circle. I decided to follow her instructions. I was going to purchase a gown that would make Madison look invisible. The stage was set for Saturday night, and I was ready to take my seat. Saturday evening arrived with a cold, clear sky over the Boise foothills. The Silverhawk Country Club sat at the end of a winding private drive surrounded by manicured golf greens and tall pine trees. It was the epicenter of local elite society. I pulled my modest truck up to the valet stand, sandwiched between two black luxury sedans. The young valet attendant looked surprised for a fraction of a second before composing his face and taking my keys. I stepped out into the crisp evening air. My mother told me to use her bribe money to buy a dress that fit so I would not embarrass the family. I took her advice. I wore a bespoke emerald green silk gown. It featured no flashy designer logos and no sequins. It was the definition of quiet wealth. The cut was structural and flawless, draped perfectly across my shoulders. It cost 3 times the amount of the check sitting in my office desk drawer, and I paid for it using my own private checking account. I paired it with simple gold earrings and wore my hair pulled back into a sleek knot. I did not look like a charity case. I looked like the person who owned the building. I walked up the limestone steps and pushed through the heavy oak double doors. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of desperate extravagance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over 60 round tables draped in heavy white linen. A string quartet played classical music in the far corner. Waiters in black vests circulated with trays of expensive champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I approached the guest registry table near the entrance. A young hostess in a navy dress swiped through her digital seating chart on a tablet. I gave her my name. She tapped the screen and her polite smile faltered. She looked up at me, then looked back down at her tablet. She shifted her weight uncomfortably. "Miss Robinson," she said, her voice dropping to an awkward whisper. "Your sister Madison left specific instructions regarding your seating arrangement. I am supposed to escort you to table 32. She gestured toward the very back of the sprawling ballroom. I followed her hand. Table 32 was positioned in a dark alcove, situated inches away from the swinging metal doors of the kitchen service entrance. It was practically behind a decorative pillar. The lighting there was dim. The primary view was a wall of floral arrangements designed to block the service traffic from the main party. It was a physical manifestation of my family status. They invited me because Grandma Beatrice demanded it, but they intended to keep me hidden in the dark. The hostess watched my face, expecting an argument. She braced herself for a scene. Table 32 sounds perfect, I said. My tone was light and entirely unbothered. Please lead the way. The hostess exhaled a breath of relief and walked me through the maze of tables. As we moved deeper into the room, I felt the temperature change. The cool air conditioning of the main floor gave way to the humid heat radiating from the commercial kitchen. The faint smell of roasted tenderloin mixed with the sharp scent of industrial dish soap. I took my seat facing the wall of flowers. I was technically isolated, but my position offered a brilliant strategic advantage. I sat in the shadows where no one could see my face, but through the gaps in the floral arrangements, I had an unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. I could watch the performance without participating in the play. I ordered a glass of sparkling water and settled in. The head table sat on a raised platform at the front of the room. It was currently empty, waiting for the guest of honor. But my family circled the floor just below it. I watched my father Richard working the room. His performance was painful to observe. He practically sprinted from table to table, shaking hands with local politicians and corporate officers. His laughter was a fraction too loud. His smiles were stretched tight across his face. He was a man trying to project immense success while internally panicking about his shrinking retirement accounts. Brody was worse. He hovered near a cluster of older men wearing expensive suits. These were the private equity investors from Denver, the men Brody desperately needed to fund his Old Creek tract acquisition. I watched Brody lean into their circle, holding a rocks glass. He talked rapidly, gesturing with his free hand, trying to command their attention. The Denver investors nodded politely, but their body language was closed off. They kept glancing at their watches. Brody wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. He was projecting the frantic energy of a salesman who knows his rent is due tomorrow. Madison floated between groups, acting as the visual anchor for their shared illusion. She wore a glittering silver gown that caught the chandelier light with every step. She draped herself over Brody's arm whenever the investors looked in her direction, offering bright, cinematic smiles. She was playing the role of the wealthy developer wife securing her social territory. A gentle chime rang through the ballroom, signaling the guests to take their seats for the first course. The ambient chatter dialed down. Madison walked up the steps to the raised platform and took hold of the microphone resting on a tall stand. She tapped the mesh grill, drawing the final loose threads of attention toward the stage. She smoothed the front of her silver gown and offered a radiant, practiced smile to the crowd. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," Madison began. Her voice echoed through the high ceilings. "We are here to celebrate my incredible grandmother Beatrice and her 80 remarkable years of life. She will be arriving shortly, but I wanted to take a brief moment to welcome you all on behalf of the Robinson family." A polite ripple of applause swept through the room. "Looking around this room, I am reminded of how blessed we truly are." Madison continued pacing slowly across the stage. "We are surrounded by success, by innovation, and by profound wealth. But true wealth is not just about real estate portfolios or corporate mergers." She paused for dramatic effect. She turned her head slightly and looked past the sea of important guests. She looked straight toward the dark alcove near the kitchen doors. Her eyes locked onto the shadowy corner where she knew I was sitting. "True wealth is about family," Madison said, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. "It is about lifting up those who cannot lift themselves. It is about providing a safety net for the members of our family who struggle to find their way in the world. The Robinsons have always believed in supporting those less fortunate, even when they make choices we do not understand. Tonight is a celebration of that enduring family strength." The room remained quiet. A few guests exchanged confused glances. The Denver investors looked mildly uncomfortable. It was a thinly veiled, passive-aggressive strike delivered in front of 200 people. She was officially branding me as the family failure, establishing her own superiority under the guise of compassion. In the past, a speech like that would have crushed my spirit. It would have sent me running for the valet stand, fighting back tears of humiliation. Tonight, I just took a slow sip of my sparkling water. The lime tasted sharp and refreshing. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs under the table. I smoothed a wrinkle from my emerald silk dress. I watched my sister stand on that stage, basking in the glow of her own manufactured perfection. They thought isolating me in the back of the room was a punishment. They thought putting me next to the service doors would break my pride and keep me silent. They did not realize they had just given me a front row seat to their impending downfall. The applause following Madison's speech died down quickly. The waiters emerged from the swinging doors beside my table, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with appetizers. The guests began to converse among themselves. Madison descended the stairs and took her seat at the center of the head table, claiming the chair of highest honor right next to where Grandma Beatrice was supposed to sit. Richard walked over and patted Madison on the shoulder, looking immensely proud. Brody took the seat on her other side, leaning back and unbuttoning his suit jacket, acting like he already owned the entire country club. They were positioned at the apex of the room, ruling their fragile kingdom. Then the heavy oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open. The ambient noise in the room vanished in an instant. The true power in the family had just arrived, and she was not alone. The heavy oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open, and the ambient noise in the room vanished in an instant. The string quartet stopped playing mid-measure. 200 guests turned their heads toward the foyer. Grandma Beatrice did not just walk into a room. She held court. She stood in the doorway, wearing a floor-length navy gown, topped with a structured silver jacket. She gripped her silver-handled cane with both hands, taking a moment to survey the sprawling layout of the Silverhawk Country Club. She did not smile. She looked like a judge stepping into a courtroom to deliver a final verdict. She was not alone. My father, Richard, had bragged for weeks that he would be the one to escort the matriarch into her 80th birthday gala. He planned to walk her down the center aisle, cementing his role as the dutiful son and the head of the Robinson family. Beatrice denied him that photo opportunity. She arrived flanked by a man who looked distinctly out of place at a birthday celebration. He was tall, wearing a charcoal gray suit with a severe cut. He carried a thick leather briefcase in his left hand. I recognized him immediately from my private meetings in my grandmother's study. His name was Thomas Caldwell. He was a senior partner at a terrifyingly expensive estate firm in downtown Boise. He was a man who dealt in irrevocable trusts, corporate restructuring, and hostile takeovers. Bringing a high-powered estate attorney carrying a briefcase to a dinner party was not a fashion statement. It was a declaration of war. Richard scrambled from his position near the stage. He practically sprinted across the ballroom floor, his face flushed with a mixture of panic and forced joy. He reached the foyer and attempted to take his mother by the arm. "Mother, we have been waiting," Richard said, his voice overly loud, trying to project warmth to the watching crowd. "Let me guide you to the head table. Everyone is so eager to see you." Beatrice did not look at him. She simply shifted her weight and tapped the rubber tip of her cane against the hardwood floor. The sharp thud echoed in the silent room. Richard dropped his hand as if he had touched a hot stove. Beatrice began her walk toward the raised platform. Thomas Caldwell stepped in close behind her. Richard was forced to trail awkwardly in their wake, looking less like the patriarch of the family and more like a nervous subordinate. The guests parted like water, making a wide path for the matriarch. The Denver investors watched the procession with sharp, calculating eyes. They were men who understood power dynamics, and they could clearly see that Richard held zero authority over this woman. Beatrice reached the steps of the raised platform. The head table was arranged to face the entire ballroom. Madison sat in the chair to the immediate right of the center seat. In the hierarchy of high society seating arrangements, the chair to the right of the guest of honor was the apex of favor. Madison sat tall, smoothing her silver gown, her face glowing with a smug, triumphant smile. She was ready to be photographed beside the source of the family wealth. Beatrice climbed the 3 carpeted steps. She stopped in front of the table. She looked down at Madison. "That seat is taken," Beatrice said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the chilling clarity of breaking ice. Madison blinked, her perfect smile faltering. She gestured to the empty chair in the center. "Oh no, Grandma. Your seat is right here in the middle. I made sure they saved the best spot for you." Beatrice did not move. "I am perfectly aware of where my chair is, Madison. I am talking about your chair. You are sitting in the wrong place." The color drained from Madison's face. The silence in the ballroom grew heavy. This was not a private family squabble. This was a public execution of social standing. Madison looked at Richard for help, but my father was frozen, staring at Thomas Caldwell and the leather briefcase resting by the attorney's feet. Beatrice turned her back on the head table. She stood at the edge of the platform and scanned the sea of faces in the ballroom. She ignored the mayor. She ignored the wealthy developers. She looked past the sparkling chandeliers and the elaborate centerpieces. Her gaze traveled all the way to the back of the room, past the final row of guest tables. Her eyes locked onto the dark alcove near the kitchen doors. She found me sitting behind the wall of floral arrangements. Beatrice gestured to the club manager, a man named Julian, who stood nervously near the edge of the stage. Julian, Beatrice said, "My granddaughter Nora is sitting in a drafty corner next to a service door. Please go retrieve her. Instruct your staff to move her place setting to the center of the head table directly to my right." Julian swallowed hard, nodded, and walked swiftly down the center aisle. The entire room turned to follow his path. 200 pairs of eyes tracked the manager as he navigated the maze of tables heading toward the kitchen. I placed my sparkling water on the table and stood up. I stepped out from the shadows of the alcove into the ambient light of the ballroom. The emerald green silk of my gown caught the glow of the chandeliers. I did not look like the charity case they had whispered about. I did not look like a woman who needed a safety net. I held my head high and met the gaze of the Denver investors as I walked. I did not rush. I walked the entire length of the ballroom with slow, measured steps. The sound of my heels clicked in rhythm against the hardwood dance floor. I felt the shock radiating from the guests. They had listened to Madison's passive-aggressive speech about supporting the less fortunate just 10 minutes ago. Now they were watching the matriarch of the family elevate me above the rest of them. I reached the platform and walked up the steps. Madison was still sitting in the chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. "Move," Beatrice ordered. Madison stood up, her cheeks burning a deep mottled red. She picked up her silk clutch and her champagne flute. She was forced to walk down to the far end of the long table, taking a lesser seat next to Brody. The country club staff rushed forward, carrying my pristine white dinner plate and crystal glasses, relocating them to the seat of honor. I sat down next to my grandmother. Thomas Caldwell took the seat on her left, placing his leather briefcase deliberately on the table for a brief moment before resting it by his feet. Richard stepped up to the microphone, his forehead shining with nervous sweat. He let out a loud, hollow laugh, trying desperately to spin the humiliation into a charming anecdote. "Well, you all know our mother," Richard said, gripping the microphone stand tight enough to turn his hands pale. "She always had a soft spot for the underdog." Let us give a round of applause for Beatrice and her eccentric heart. A few scattered guests clapped, but the applause died quickly. The Denver investors did not laugh. They leaned back in their chairs, studying the head table. They saw Madison fuming at the far end. They saw Richard sweating. They saw the imposing estate attorney sitting guard. And they saw me sitting in the seat of power, wearing custom silk and looking entirely unbothered. The social hierarchy of the room had fractured. The pristine glass house my family built was showing deep, dangerous cracks. Dinner service began with a sudden clatter of silver covers and pouring wine. The waiters moved quickly, trying to break the suffocating tension in the room. I looked down the table at Brody. His jaw was clenched tight. The Denver investors were seated at the table directly below him, and he could see them whispering among themselves. The shift in power terrified him. He knew he was losing control of the narrative, and he needed their money to survive the week. Brody took a long gulp of his bourbon. I could see the desperate calculation in his eyes. He realized he needed to reclaim the attention of the room. He needed to project dominance and prove his worth to the men holding the capital. He set his glass down hard and leaned forward, preparing to make the biggest pitch of his life. The waiters moved in a synchronized rhythm around the ballroom. Heavy silver clattered softly against fine bone china as plates of roasted tenderloin and asparagus were placed before the guests. The string quartet shifted to a low-tempo piece, providing an elegant background hum. But at the head table, the atmosphere was anything but elegant. Brody sat at the far end of the raised platform. His demotion from the center seat was a physical wound to his fragile ego. He could feel the calculating gaze of the private equity men from Denver drilling into the side of his head. Those men sat at the premium table positioned just below the stage. They held the keys to his survival. They managed venture funds that could wipe out his debts with a single signature. But they were financial predators. They smelled weakness, and Brody reeked of it. He had just been publicly humbled by an 80-year-old woman and forced to sit on the fringe of his own family celebration. He needed to project dominance. He needed to reclaim the narrative before the main course was cleared. Brody adjusted his silk tie and turned his chair to angle toward the investor table. He raised his voice, carrying it over the ambient noise of the room. He did not bother with small talk. He launched directly into a desperate sales pitch, using the dinner conversation as his boardroom presentation. The Boise market is oversaturated with amateur developers fighting over scraps, Brody declared, cutting aggressively into his stake. But real wealth is found in unmapped territory. You have to find the untouched canvas and have the vision to pave it. He laid out his blueprint for the Old Creek tract. He described the 500 acres of pristine wilderness not as a sanctuary, but as a raw commodity waiting to be monetized. He talked about bulldozing the historic red barns that had stood on the property for a century, claiming the wood could be salvaged and sold for a premium. He outlined his plan to clear-cut the ancient pine forests to make room for generic clubhouse amenities and concrete tennis courts. He bragged about rerouting the natural streams to create artificial sterile water features for the luxury lots. He was essentially describing a crime scene. Grandma Beatrice sat on my left. She did not look at Brody. She kept her eyes focused straight ahead on her plate. But I saw the physical toll his words took on her. She gripped her silver knife so tight, her knuckles turned a pale, translucent white. She was listening to a hollow, arrogant man describe the systematic destruction of her family heritage. She was listening to him detail the erasure of the land she grew up on, the very dirt her father had worked. Yet she remained perfectly silent. She was letting him dig the hole as deep as he possibly could. Brody mistook her silence for submission. He grew bolder, leaning over his plate to address the Denver men directly. He told them that acquiring the land was the hardest part of the process, but he had already done the heavy lifting. The current deed is held by a shell company called Silver Pine, LLC. Brody boasted, taking a large swallow of his bourbon. They are a ghost corporation. Probably some out-of-state holding firm that bit off way more than they could chew. I have been applying pressure for months. We have a preliminary agreement on the table right now. One of the Denver men, a silver-haired executive with cold assessing eyes, leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. A preliminary agreement is not a signature, Brody. What makes you think they will close at your offering price? Brody let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. Because I know how to read the board, he said. Silver Pine, LLC is overextended. They are bleeding capital and they are desperate for cash flow. I have them backed into a corner and they know my offer is the exact lifeline they need. They have no other options. I finished chewing a piece of my dinner. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I set the crystal glass down on the white linen tablecloth and folded my hands in my lap. I looked down the length of the head table directly at my brother-in-law. Brody, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried a specific resonance that cut through the surrounding chatter. How are you handling the riparian buffer zones? Brody stopped mid-sentence. He blinked, staring at me as if a piece of the floral centerpiece had just spoken. Madison turned her head, her eyes narrowing into a sharp warning glare. The Old Creek tract borders a Class 1 river system. I continued, keeping my tone conversational and genuinely inquisitive. The State Environmental Commission recently updated their soil permeability requirements. You cannot pour concrete foundations within 200 feet of the high water mark without a specialized ecological variance. Factoring in the natural curve of the river, that setback requirement eliminates roughly 40% of your prime waterfront buildable acreage. How did you adjust your profit margins to account for the lost square footage? Silence fell over the head table. The Denver investors stopped eating. They looked from me to Brody, waiting for his answer. Brody opened his mouth, but nothing came out. A faint sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He stared at me with blank, panicked eyes. He had no idea what a riparian buffer zone was. He was a surface-level flipper. He dealt in shiny marketing brochures and aesthetic trim. He did not understand the dirt. He did not know the law of the land. Madison recognized the sheer panic radiating from her husband. She jumped in to rescue him, using the only weapon she possessed: condescension. She let out a high-pitched, theatrical laugh that echoed uncomfortably across the platform. "Oh," Nora Madison said, waving her manicured hand through the air as if swatting away a persistent fly. "Listen to you trying to use those big technical words. Do not worry your head about high-level commercial real estate, sweetie. You just stick to your little plants and let the men handle the millions." My father Richard chuckled from his seat, nodding eagerly in agreement with Madison. He was desperate to restore the established family dynamic in front of the watching crowd. Exactly, Richard said. Brody has a team of expensive lawyers to handle the minor red tape. We do not need to bore our important guests with gardening logistics. Brody fed off their validation. His chest puffed out and his arrogant smirk returned. He looked at the Denver investors, dismissing my question with a confident shake of his head. My wife is right, Brody said. You pay engineers to worry about the dirt. You pay developers to see the vision. And the vision is a done deal. The owners of Silver Pine, LLC, are desperate to sell. They need the liquidity to cover their own mistakes. They will sign the final transfer papers first thing Monday morning. I looked at Brody's flushed, arrogant face. I looked at Madison's smug, satisfied smile. I looked at my parents nodding along in blind, foolish agreement. I picked up my crystal glass. The ice clinked softly against the rim. I offered Brody a warm, pleasant smile. I'm sure they are, I said quietly. I took a sip of water and turned my attention back to the ballroom floor. Beside me, I heard Grandma Beatrice let out a single breath that sounded remarkably like a genuine laugh. Thomas Caldwell, the formidable estate attorney, sat silently observing the exchange with the cold, calculated eyes of a man measuring a coffin. The dinner plates were eventually cleared away, leaving the guests with dark coffee and delicate pastries. The tension in the ballroom had not dissipated. It hung in the air heavy and thick. The shifting power dynamics at the head table left the elite attendees whispering behind their linen napkins. Richard could feel his perfect networking event slipping through his fingers. He felt the judgment of his peers pressing in on him. He needed to reclaim the spotlight. He needed to project the illusion of the flawless Robinson family to secure his own fading reputation. Richard pushed his chair back and stood up. He picked up his champagne flute and a silver dessert spoon. He began tapping the glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the murmurs, demanding the attention of the room. It was time for his toast. Richard Robinson stood at the edge of the raised platform, looking out over the Silverhawk Country Club ballroom. The sharp ringing of his dessert spoon against the champagne flute echoed through the high ceilings, demanding total silence. The waiters froze mid-stride. 200 guests turned their attention toward the stage. This was the moment my father had been rehearsing in front of his bathroom mirror for weeks. This was his grand performance. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket and cleared his throat, leaning into the microphone stand. He painted a wide, practiced smile across his face. Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests and dear friends. Richard began, his voice booming with artificial warmth. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a truly remarkable milestone. 80 years of grace, 80 years of wisdom, and 80 years of building the Robinson legacy. Tonight, we honor my mother, Beatrice. A polite smattering of applause rolled through the room. Richard nodded graciously, accepting the applause as if it were meant entirely for him. But as we celebrate the past, Richard continued, his tone shifting into the cadence of a corporate sales pitch. We must also look toward the future. The Robinson family has always stood for growth. We believe in taking the foundation built by previous generations and expanding it, pushing the boundaries of what is possible in this great state of Idaho. He spent the next 5 minutes delivering a masterclass in narcissistic grandstanding. He did not talk about Beatrice's resilience or her quiet philanthropy. He talked about his own supposed achievements. He spun vague tales of complex market navigations and strategic investments, conveniently omitting the fact that his portfolio was currently bleeding cash. He was weaving a fiction of unassailable financial dominance for the benefit of the Denver private equity men sitting directly below him. Richard then pivoted, extending his arm toward the far end of the head table. And looking toward the future, I am filled with immense pride when I look at my youngest daughter, Madison Richard, declared. Madison, you have inherited the true Robinson business acumen. You have taken the local real estate market by storm closing deals that seasoned veterans would envy. And you have done it all with such effortless elegance. Madison preened under the spotlight, touching her silver necklace and offering a demure smile to the crowd. Richard turned his attention to Brody. His voice swelled with unearned affection. And Brody, he said, placing his hand over his heart. When Madison brought you home, I knew immediately that you belonged with us. You possess the drive, the vision, and the sheer force of will that this family values above all else. You are not just a son-in-law, Brody. You are the son I never had. I know that your upcoming projects are going to redefine the landscape of this valley. Brody puffed out his chest, raising his bourbon glass in a silent salute. The Denver investors exchanged blank, unreadable glances. Richard had established the hierarchy. He had praised himself. He had elevated the golden child, and he had knighted the favored son-in-law. He had painted the picture of a flawless, wealthy, united dynasty. But he had a loose end to tie up. He needed to address my presence at the center of the head table, sitting right next to the matriarch. He needed to explain the charity case to his elite audience. Richard turned slightly, looking down the table at me. The forced warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, patronizing distance. And of course, we have Nora. Richard said, his voice dropping an octave. The entire ballroom shifted its focus to me. 200 faces waited for the patriarch's judgment. Nora is still finding her way in the world. Richard continued, offering a tight, sympathetic smile to the crowd. She has chosen a different path, a simpler life out in the dirt, away from the pressures of corporate commerce. And while we may not always understand her choices, we are just so glad that we can be a strong, secure safety net for her. That is what family does. We support those who struggle to support themselves. A smattering of highly uncomfortable applause rippled through the room. Several guests looked down at their coffee cups, unable to meet my eyes. It was a brutal public dismissal, masked as a declaration of love. He was telling the entire room that I was weak, that I was incompetent, and that I only existed by the grace of his charity. I looked out into the crowd. I saw my mother, Beverly, sitting at the premium family table directly below the stage. She was nodding in smug, satisfied agreement. She took a sip of her champagne, clearly pleased that Richard had successfully neutralized my presence. They thought they had won. They thought the $1,000 check sitting in my office drawer had bought my silence and my submission. I did not object. I did not stand up and shout about my state contracts or my profit margins. I did not pull out the screenshots of the group chat. I just sat quietly in my custom emerald silk gown, holding my posture perfect and still. I turned my head and looked to my left. Grandma Beatrice was sitting beside me. She had listened to every word of her son's hollow speech. She listened to him claim credit for her legacy. She listened to him praise the man who intended to pave over her ancestral land. She listened to him publicly humiliate me. Beatrice picked up her heavy linen napkin. She slowly and deliberately wiped the corners of her mouth. She placed the napkin on the table next to her crystal water goblet. She turned her head slightly and made a single sharp gesture toward Thomas Caldwell. The formidable estate attorney did not speak. He simply reached down, unclasped the brass locks on his leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick black legal binder. He placed the binder squarely on the white tablecloth in front of Beatrice. Beatrice placed both hands on the silver handle of her cane. She pushed her chair back and stood up. She did not wait for Richard to introduce her. She did not wait for the applause to finish. She simply walked past him, stepping up to the microphone stand. Richard instinctively stepped back, his confident smile faltering as his mother seized control of the stage. The low hum of conversation in the ballroom evaporated. The clinking of silverware ceased entirely. The room went pin-drop silent. 200 elite guests held their breath, recognizing the tectonic shift in gravity radiating from the 80-year-old woman at the microphone. Richard claims that this family is stronger and more united than ever, Beatrice said. Her voice did not echo. It sliced through the quiet air with the precision of a scalpel. He paints a beautiful picture of support and unconditional love. She paused, scanning the frozen faces of the crowd. At 80 years old, I find that I have very little patience left for pleasant fictions, Beatrice declared. I think it is time we examine exactly what that family unity looks like behind closed doors. She turned her head and signaled to the audiovisual technicians positioned in the sound booth at the back of the ballroom. The massive digital screens flanking the main stage suddenly flickered to life. The dual 10-foot digital displays, normally reserved for nostalgic slideshows of smiling family vacations, illuminated the dark corners of the Silverhawk Country Club ballroom. A harsh blue glare washed over the crystal chandeliers and the white linen tablecloths. The screens did not show grainy childhood photographs of my grandmother. They displayed high-resolution captures of an iMessage thread. The header at the top of the projected images read "Real Family" in stark black text. Beatrice adjusted the microphone on the wooden podium. "Thank you, Richard," she said, her voice echoing across the silent room. "That was a fascinating piece of creative storytelling. You have always had a unique gift for fiction." Richard froze at the base of the stage. He looked from the glowing screens to his mother, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The champagne flute in his hand trembled slightly, spilling a few drops of expensive vintage onto the polished hardwood floor. "I am 80 years old today," Beatrice announced, holding the gaze of the powerful men seated in the front rows. "At my age, time is a finite currency. I refuse to spend another second of it indulging in pleasant fictions. My son just stood before you and claimed this family is united by unconditional love. I would like to show you exactly what his version of unity looks like when he thinks no authorities are watching." She pulled a pair of tortoiseshell reading glasses from the pocket of her tailored jacket. She placed them on the bridge of her nose and looked up at the towering displays. "Let us review the historical record," Beatrice said. She pointed her silver-handled cane toward the left display. "On October 12th of last year, my daughter-in-law Beverly sent a photograph of Nora parked outside her home. Beverly included an emoji simulating physical illness." Beatrice read the accompanying text out loud. Her voice was steady, projecting the cruel syllables to the farthest corners of the room. Beverly wrote, "I cannot believe she parked that rusty eyesore in our driveway. The neighbors are going to think we are running a halfway house." The silence in the ballroom deepened into a suffocating vacuum. I watched my mother sink lower in her chair at the premium family table. The country club socialites sitting beside Beverly, the women she played tennis with every Tuesday, physically shifted their weight. They leaned away, creating a distinct visible gap between themselves and my mother. Social exile in this circle did not happen with a shouting match. It happened with a silent, subtle withdrawal of proximity. Beatrice did not stop. She signaled the sound booth, and the slide transitioned with a sharp click. "Here is a message from my son Richard sent 3 weeks before Christmas." Beatrice continued. Richard wrote, "I have $50 that says the charity case asked to borrow cash before the holidays." Madison replied, "I will take that bet, Dad. Make it 100. She will be crying poor by Thanksgiving." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The mayor of Boise set his coffee cup down with a sharp clatter, the sound ringing out in the quiet space. The wealthy developers who had just listened to Richard brag about family loyalty now stared at him with open disgust. These were ruthless business professionals who negotiated brutal corporate mergers, but even they adhered to a certain code of public decency. Mocking your own child for sport was a social crime they could not overlook. It signaled a severe lack of character, and in their world, character was collateral. I remembered sitting in my office, smelling the damp cedar of my greenhouses, feeling the cold anger when I first read those messages. Watching them projected in front of the city council and the richest venture capitalists in the state, the anger evaporated. It was replaced by a profound clinical satisfaction. This was not revenge. Revenge requires emotion. This was simply transparency. I was watching sunlight disinfect a wound. Beatrice signaled for the next slide. This one was the most damaging. It was the exchange from 5 years ago, the day my life fractured. This final conversation occurred the week Nora endured a very painful divorce. Beatrice stated, her tone dropping to a lethal quiet. "Let us see how the United Robinson family offered their safety net." She read Madison's text verbatim. "The dead weight is finally gone." She read Beverly's response. "Nora never had the drive to keep a good man anyway." She read Richard's contribution. "She will probably be moving into our basement by Christmas. Divorce is an expensive embarrassment." Madison let out a stifled sob. The golden child was sitting at the far end of the head table, stripped of her center seat and stripped of her dignity. She buried her face in her manicured hands, trying to hide from the blinding glare of her own projected cruelty. The silver designer gown she wore suddenly looked ridiculous, like a cheap costume on a terrible actor. Brody sat rigidly beside her, staring straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact with the Denver investors. Those men were currently evaluating his character and evaluating his risk profile. Being married to a toxic liability was bad for business. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock. The preservation instinct kicked in, overriding his common sense. He lunged forward, scrambling up the carpeted steps of the platform toward the stage. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "Turn it off," Richard shouted, waving his arms frantically toward the sound booth at the back of the room. "Cut the feed right now. This is a private family matter." He reached for the thick black audiovisual cords running along the base of the podium. He intended to physically rip the wiring from the wall and plunge the room into darkness. He never made it to the cables. Thomas Caldwell stepped out from behind the head table. The estate attorney moved with surprising speed for a man in a tailored charcoal suit. He positioned his tall frame directly in Richard's path, forming an impenetrable human barrier between my father and the podium. Caldwell was not just a lawyer, he was a fixture of the Idaho legal establishment. You did not cross him unless you wanted your assets frozen by dawn. Richard collided with Caldwell's shoulder and stumbled backward. He looked up at the attorney, his chest heaving, his pristine tuxedo jacket rumpled. "Move aside," Thomas Richard demanded, his voice cracking with panic. Caldwell adjusted his crisp white cuffs and looked down at my father with the detached expression of a coroner examining a chart. "I highly advise against causing a physical altercation at your mother's birthday event," Richard, the attorney, said smoothly. "The audiovisual presentation was commissioned by my client. It will continue until she is finished. If you touch those cables, I will personally file charges for destruction of private property and reckless endangerment. Please return to your seat." Richard stood on the steps, breathing heavily. He looked out at the 200 guests. He saw the cold judgment in their eyes. He saw the Denver investors whispering furiously to one another, pulling out their phones to draft urgent emails. His flawless reputation was disintegrating in real time, illuminated by the harsh blue light of his own text messages. Defeated, he backed slowly down the stairs. He did not return to his table. He collapsed into an empty chair near the edge of the dance floor, staring blankly at the polished wood. I remained seated at the center of the head table. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I took another slow sip of my sparkling water and watched the house of cards fall. They built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority. They derived their power from keeping me small and manageable. Now the matriarch of the family had stripped away their facade, exposing the decaying framework beneath. Beatrice took her tortoiseshell reading glasses off and folded them neatly. She placed them inside her tailored jacket. She looked down at Richard sitting slumped in his chair. The glow of the screens highlighted the deep lines of stress mapping his face. "You spent 5 years hiding Nora in the shadows," Beatrice said, her voice carrying one final time across the ballroom. "You called her a failure to make yourselves feel important. You called her a charity case." Beatrice turned and placed her hand flat on the thick black legal binder Thomas Caldwell had set on the white tablecloth earlier. She tapped her fingers against the leather binding. So Beatrice concluded, staring directly at her son. "Let us talk about charity." The digital screens projecting the real family group chat faded to black, leaving the Silverhawk Country Club ballroom plunged back into the softer ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers. The sudden absence of the harsh blue light did not relieve the tension. It only sharpened the anticipation. The guests remained perfectly still, watching the 80-year-old matriarch standing at the podium with her hand resting on a thick black legal binder. Beatrice surveyed the crowd. Her posture was uncompromising. She was not a woman prone to emotional outbursts or dramatic theatrics. Every move she made was calculated, measured, and engineered for maximum impact. She had just dismantled the social standing of my parents and my sister. Now she was preparing to dismantle their financial reality. For 5 years, I have watched this family operate under the assumption that they are entitled to the Robinson legacy. Beatrice began, her voice steady and clear. "I have watched Richard chase speculative investments to fund a lifestyle he cannot afford. I have watched Madison construct a glittering facade built entirely on borrowed capital. I have watched them define success by the brand of their cars and the square footage of their heavily mortgaged homes." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. The Denver private equity investors who had been evaluating Brody earlier were now taking mental notes on the entire Robinson clan. They were witnessing the systematic unspooling of a local dynasty. And for 5 years, I have watched them try to erase. Nora. Beatrice continued, turning her head slightly to acknowledge me sitting at the head table. They called her a charity case because she chose to build something real in the dirt rather than something fake in the country club. They assumed she was weak because she was quiet. They mistook her patience for failure. Richard sat slumped in his chair near the edge of the dance floor, staring at his shoes. His pristine tuxedo felt like a straitjacket. The realization that his mother had seen through his carefully constructed illusions for half a decade was paralyzing. He had spent his entire adult life waiting to inherit the family fortune, believing it was his birthright, regardless of his performance. Beatrice opened the heavy black legal binder. The sound of the thick parchment pages turning echoed softly in the quiet room. She retrieved a document bearing the raised seal of the state of Idaho. Thomas Caldwell, the formidable estate attorney, stepped forward and stood shoulder to shoulder with Beatrice. His presence validated every word she was about to speak. A legacy is not an entitlement, Beatrice declared, her voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre. It is a responsibility. It requires stewardship, vision, and an understanding of the foundation upon which it was built. I spent decades building the Robinson portfolio alongside my husband. I will not allow the remainder of my life's work to be squandered by individuals who treat wealth as a prop for social media. She held up the document bearing the state seal. Effective this morning at 9 o'clock, I formally dissolved the Robinson Family Revocable Trust, Beatrice announced. The words landed like physical blows. Richard jerked his head up, his eyes wide, with sudden visceral terror. The color drained from his face, leaving him a pale ashen gray. Dissolving the revocable trust meant the inheritance he had been banking on, the safety net he intended to use to cover his failing investments, was gone, evaporated with a single signature. Madison gasped from her seat at the far end of the head table, dropping her face into her hands. Brody sat frozen, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. The financial bedrock they had assumed would always be there to bail them out had just crumbled beneath their feet. I have liquidated all non-essential assets. Beatrice continued reading from the legal summary. I have transferred 100% of my remaining commercial real estate holdings, my private equity shares, and my liquid capital into a newly established irrevocable trust. This new entity is designed to protect the assets from creditors' mismanagement and entitled heirs. The Denver investors exchanged sharp, knowing glances. They understood the legal implications of an irrevocable trust. Once the assets were transferred, they could not be touched, altered, or reclaimed by anyone outside the designated parameters. Beatrice was locking the vault and throwing away the key. Beatrice adjusted her tortoiseshell reading glasses. She looked down at the final page of the document. The new trust has a single designated beneficiary. Beatrice read, her voice clear and uncompromising. It vests full ownership and executive control immediately upon establishment. The sole beneficiary of the Beatrice Robinson Irrevocable Trust is Nora Robinson. The silence in the ballroom fractured into a wave of hushed, chaotic murmurs. 200 elite guests turned to stare at me, sitting quietly at the center of the head table. The charity case, the daughter hidden by the service doors, the woman mocked in the group chat, was now the undisputed heir to the Robinson empire. But Beatrice was not finished. She had one more revelation to deliver. Furthermore, Beatrice stated, raising her hand to quiet the murmuring crowd. I want to clarify a misconception regarding Nora's financial acumen. My granddaughter is not a passive recipient of this transfer. For the last 3 years, Nora has served as the silent managing director of my private portfolio. Richard let out a choked sound that was half gasp, half sob. He stared at me as if I were a stranger who had just broken into his home. While Richard was busy attending galas and making poor speculative bets on commercial strip malls, Nora was sitting in my study, restructuring my tax liabilities, Beatrice revealed. While Madison was bragging about leased sports cars, Nora was negotiating agricultural land leases that generated steady 8% returns. Nora has a higher documented net worth through her native plant nursery state contracts than Richard, Beverly, Madison, and Brody combined. The public humiliation was absolute. The golden child narrative was not just dismantled, it was incinerated. My parents and my sister had spent 5 years mocking a woman who was mathematically and legally their financial superior. They had treated me like a liability while I was quietly managing the very fortune they intended to steal. I did not react to the revelation. I maintained my posture, keeping my expression neutral and unreadable. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I felt the collective gaze of the Boise elite pressing down on me, but I did not shrink. I wore my emerald silk gown like armor. Beatrice closed the black legal binder with a definitive thud. She handed it to Thomas Caldwell, who placed it securely back into his leather briefcase. My birthday celebration is officially concluded, Beatrice announced, stepping away from the microphone. I suggest those of you with over-leveraged portfolios spend the rest of the evening evaluating your risk management. She turned and walked slowly down the steps of the platform, leaning on her silver-handled cane. Thomas Caldwell followed closely behind her. The guests parted, forming a wide, respectful path as the matriarch exited the ballroom. She did not look back. I remained seated at the head table. The ambient chatter in the room began to swell into a dull roar. The Denver investors were already standing up, signaling to their associates, pulling on their suit jackets. They had seen enough. The illusion of the Robinson dynasty was shattered, and they had no intention of investing capital in a family defined by public humiliation and financial ruin. Brody watched his potential lifelines walking toward the exit. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. He realized his entire future was walking out the door. The Old Creek Tract acquisition, the luxury subdivision, the millions of dollars he desperately needed to pay off his mounting debts were slipping through his fingers. He needed a miracle. He needed to prove he was still a dominant player. He pushed his chair back violently, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the platform. He grabbed his bourbon glass and stood up, preparing to make a desperate final stand. The ambient noise of the departing guests created a low rumble in the ballroom. Men and women in formal evening wear were retrieving their coats and heading for the valet stand. The Denver private equity investors had seen enough. The lead investor buttoned his suit jacket and turned his back on the head table, signaling his associates to follow. They were walking away, taking their venture capital with them. Brody watched his financial lifeline moving toward the exit. The veneer of the slick, successful developer vanished. The man left standing was a cornered animal, realizing the trap had closed. He pushed his chair back so hard it tipped over and crashed against the stage floor. The loud wooden clatter echoed through the room, causing several departing guests to pause and turn around. "Wait!" Brody shouted. He stepped out from behind the head table, his face flushed and covered in a fine sheen of sweat. "Gentlemen, wait a moment, please." The Denver investors stopped near the double doors, looking back at him with cold irritation. Brody raised his voice, desperate to reclaim the narrative in front of the remaining crowd. He pointed a trembling finger toward the foyer where Beatrice had exited. "I do not need that old woman or her trust fund. I never needed it. My firm is entirely self-sufficient. We are on the verge of closing the most lucrative land acquisition in the history of this county." He was lying through his teeth, trying to project strength while standing on a sinking ship. "The Old Creek Tract," Brody declared, his voice echoing across the half-empty ballroom. 500 acres of prime waterfront real estate. We have the capital aligned. We have the zoning blueprints finalized. The current owners are desperate for liquidity. Silver Pine, LLC, is signing the final transfer papers first thing Monday morning. When that ink dries, my firm will clear $8 million in the first quarter alone. He looked around the room, his chest heaving, demanding respect. He looked at my father, Richard, who was still sitting in a state of catatonic shock. He looked at Madison, who was wiping ruined mascara from her cheeks. He was trying to prove he was still the alpha male of the family, the golden son-in-law who would save them all from this humiliation. I sat at the center of the table, watching his frantic performance. I let him finish his desperate pitch. I let the silence settle over the room, giving his words time to hang in the air. Then I spoke. "They will not be signing anything, Brody," I said. My voice was not loud. I did not need to shout to command the room. The acoustics of the ballroom carried my words perfectly. Brody snapped his head toward me. The panic in his eyes morphed into pure, unadulterated hatred. He had just watched me inherit the fortune he believed was destined for his wife. He saw me sitting in the seat of power wearing custom silk, and he wanted to tear me down to his level. "Keep your mouth shut," Nora Brody snarled. He stepped closer to my end of the table, gripping the edge of the white linen. "You might have manipulated a senile old woman into signing over a bank account, but you do not know the first thing about commercial real estate. You are a gardener. You plant shrubs. You have zero concept of how a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition works, so stay out of men's business." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in defense. I simply stood up. I smoothed the front of my emerald gown. I picked up my small black designer clutch from the table. The brass clasp made a sharp clicking sound as I opened it. I reached inside and withdrew a single piece of heavy matte cardstock. I placed the business card face up on the polished wooden perimeter of the head table. I pressed my index finger against the paper and pushed it forward. The card slid down the long expanse of the table, gliding over the smooth wood until it stopped directly in front of Brody. "Read it," I instructed quietly. Brody stared at the small rectangular piece of paper as if it were a live explosive. He hesitated, his jaw working back and forth. Slowly, he reached down and picked it up. I watched his eyes scan the minimal black text printed on the cream background. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched the remaining blood drain from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse in a tailored suit. The card contained 3 lines of text. Silver Pine, LLC, Nora Robinson, sole owner and chief executive officer. The silence in the room grew heavy and suffocating. The Denver investors lingering by the doors narrowed their eyes, sensing the final collapse of Brody's narrative. I bought the old creek track 6 months ago. Brody, I said, keeping my tone conversational and precise. I purchased it from the out-of-state holding firm using cash generated by my state municipal contracts. Brody opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The business card trembled in his hand. You spent the last 8 months bragging about paving over my great-grandfather's land. I continued. You sat at family dinners and detailed exactly how you planned to destroy the ancestral forests to build your sterile luxury subdivision. You thought you were so clever, trying to monetize the very dirt my father lost decades ago. Madison let out a sharp gasp from the end of the table, finally understanding the magnitude of the trap. She looked at her husband and realized he owned nothing. I never had any intention of selling that land to you, I said, holding Brody's panicked gaze. I allowed your lawyers to draft those preliminary agreements. I let you spend thousands of dollars in billable legal hours negotiating the terms. I let you believe you had me backed into a corner because I needed you distracted. Distracted, Brody managed to whisper, his voice cracking. Yes, I replied. I needed you focused on the purchase price while I focused on the zoning board. As of last Friday afternoon, the Old Creek Tract is legally classified as a permanent conservation easement. I filed the paperwork myself. The entire 500 acres is now a protected ecological reserve. The words landed like a fatal physical blow. A permanent conservation easement meant the land could never be commercially developed. It could never be subdivided, paved, or logged. It was legally locked away from developers forever. You cannot build a single concrete foundation on that soil. Brody, I stated, your luxury subdivision is dead. Your $8 million profit projection is a fantasy. And your holding company is currently holding nothing but millions of dollars in adjustable rate debt. The Denver private equity men did not wait to hear another word. They turned around, pushed through the heavy oak doors, and exited the Silverhawk Country Club. They walked away from Brody, and they would never take his phone calls again. Brody dropped the business card onto the table. It fluttered against the white linen landing face up. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the raised platform. The confident, arrogant developer was gone. He was a ruined man staring at the woman he had called a charity case. You planned this, he choked out, gripping his hair with both hands. You set me up. You destroyed my company. I picked up my small black clutch and snapped it shut. I did not destroy your company, Brody, I said, my voice devoid of any pity. You over-leveraged your own firm to fund a lifestyle you could not afford. You made promises to investors based on land you did not own. You built a house of cards and you handed me the fan. I just turned it on. I looked past him to where my father Richard was sitting. He was staring at the stage where the screens had been. He realized he had lost his mother, his inheritance, and his social standing in a single evening. He realized he had traded a daughter who built an empire for a son-in-law who built a mountain of debt. I looked at my mother, Beverly, who was sitting alone at the premium table abandoned by her high society friends. I looked at Madison, who was sobbing openly, her silver gown looking entirely out of place amidst the wreckage of her life. The dinner party was over. The trap had snapped shut, and the truth had cleared the room. I was ready to have the final conversation they had been avoiding for 5 years. The ballroom emptied with the ruthless efficiency of a sinking ship being abandoned by its rats. No one lingered to say goodbye or offer hollow sympathies. The clinking of glasses and the hum of polite conversation vanished, replaced by the stark sound of the country club staff hastily clearing plates. Waiters moved through the maze of tables, avoiding eye contact with the head table as if failure was a contagious disease. Within 10 minutes, the grand space was desolate. 200 guests were gone. The string quartet had packed their instruments and slipped out the side door. The only people left in the sprawling room were the 5 of us. My father Richard stood near the edge of the dance floor. The tailored tuxedo he wore now hung on his frame like borrowed clothing. The illusion of the powerful patriarch had dissolved, leaving behind a man cornered by his own hubris. He stared at the empty tables, his breathing heavy and uneven. Then he turned his gaze to me. The shock paralyzing his features morphed into a desperate, searing rage. He needed a scapegoat. He had spent his entire life blaming others for his financial missteps, and tonight was no different. He marched toward the head table, his fists clenched at his sides. "You planned this from the start," Richard hissed, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "You manipulated your grandmother into cutting me out. You orchestrated this entire public circus just to destroy your own blood. You sat there all night waiting for the right moment to humiliate us." I remained standing behind the long table. I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms defensively. I looked at the man who had dismissed me for 34 years and felt nothing but a clinical detachment. I did not orchestrate anything. "Richard," I replied, my tone flat and even. "I simply attended the birthday party I was invited to attend." "Do not lie to me," he shouted, taking another step forward. "You set Brody up to fail. You stole that land out from under him. You deliberately embarrassed your mother and your sister in front of the most important people in Boise. You ruined my reputation." I picked up my silk clutch from the table and walked slowly down the steps of the raised platform. I closed the physical distance between us, not to intimidate him, but to ensure he heard every single syllable of my response. "Let us stick to the facts," I said, stopping 3 feet away from him. "I did not write those 95 text messages. I did not force you to place cash bets on my potential bankruptcy. I did not ask Madison to laugh at my divorce. Your reputation is ruined because your own words were projected onto a screen. You destroyed your social standing the moment you pressed send." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but I did not yield the floor. I did not steal any land. I continued holding his gaze. I purchased commercial real estate using legally acquired funds through a standard municipal bidding process. I did not force Brody to leverage his entire firm on a speculative deal without securing the deed first. Brody chose to take out those loans. Brody chose to lie to his investors about having a finalized agreement. I am not responsible for his terrible business acumen. Brody was still leaning against the stage, his head in his hands, unable to formulate a defense. He knew every word I spoke was a verifiable truth. "And I did not embarrass anyone tonight," I added, looking toward the dark alcove near the kitchen doors. "I did not arrange the seating chart. Madison chose to hide me behind a floral arrangement next to the service entrance. Madison chose to give a speech calling me the less fortunate relative. You built the trap. You set the bait. I just let you step in it." My mother Beverly sat at the premium table nearby. She had not moved since Grandma Beatrice walked out. Her designer makeup was smudged and her posture had crumbled. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. "Nora, please," Beverly whispered, her voice trembling. "You have made your point. We understand that we were wrong. But this is going too far. You are talking about ruining Brody and Madison. You are talking about bankrupting your father. We are still your family. We can fix this." I walked over to the table where my mother sat. I looked down at her carefully maintained hair and her expensive jewelry. For 5 years, I had desperately craved her approval. I had wanted her to defend me when the rest of the world felt cold. Standing there looking at her fragile panic, I realized I no longer needed anything from her. I reached into the pocket of my emerald silk gown. My fingers found the small folded square of paper I had tucked away earlier that morning. I pulled it out and unfolded it. The creases were sharp. The ink bearing my mother's signature was still bold. It was the check for $1,000. The bribe she had offered me to ensure I did not look like a charity case in front of their wealthy friends. I held the check between my fingers for a brief second before letting it drop. The paper drifted through the air and landed squarely in my mother's lap, resting against her designer evening wear. "You drove to my nursery this morning and tried to buy my silence for $1,000, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You told me to purchase a dress that fit, so I would not embarrass you." Beverly stared down at the check, her hands shaking. "Keep it," I told her, stepping back from the table. "It looks like you are going to need every dollar you have to help pay Brody's bankruptcy lawyers." A sharp, wretched sob broke the silence in the room. Madison pushed herself away from the far end of the head table. She stumbled down the stairs, her silver gown catching on her heels. The effortless aesthetic she curated for her social media followers was entirely gone. Her face was streaked with dark tears, and her carefully styled hair was unraveling. She crossed the dance floor and stopped in front of me. The arrogance that had defined our relationship for decades was stripped away. She was terrified. She understood the merciless math of her situation. Without the Old Creek Tract, Brody's creditors would seize their assets. The bank would foreclose on the 6,000 square foot modern farmhouse. The leased sports cars would be repossessed. Her elite friends would drop her the moment her credit card started declining. Nora. Please, Madison begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. You cannot do this to me. You cannot turn that land into a nature reserve. It is not too late to reverse the easement paperwork. You have the state contacts. You can undo it. She reached out and tried to grab my arm. I stepped back, refusing the physical contact. Sell the tract to Brody, Madison pleaded, tears spilling over her eyelashes. You have Grandma's trust fund now. You have millions of dollars. You do not need that dirt. We will pay you whatever you want. We will give you a percentage of the subdivision profits. Just sign the holding company over to us. If you do not do this, we are going to lose our house. We are going to lose everything. I looked at my younger sister. I looked at the woman who had spent 5 years deriving joy from my pain. She was asking me to pave over my great-grandfather's legacy to save her from the consequences of her own vanity. She was begging for a bailout from the very person she had tried to erase. In the past, I might have felt a flicker of guilt. The old Nora, the daughter who just wanted to belong, might have folded under the weight of her tears. But that version of me died 5 years ago when I read those text messages. The woman standing in the ballroom was an executive who understood the exact value of a boundary. I looked Madison directly in the eyes, maintaining total emotional detachment. I did not raise my voice or offer a dramatic scowl. I delivered the final verdict with the calm precision of a judge reading a sentence. I do not do charity, I said. Madison recoiled as if she had been struck across the face. She let out a hollow, gasping cry and covered her mouth with her hands. She turned away from me and sank into a chair, pulling her knees to her chest. Brody did not come over to comfort her. He remained frozen by the stage, staring into the void, realizing his professional life was over. Richard and Beverly sat in the wreckage of their networking event, surrounded by empty tables and silent judgment. They had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin and no more illusions to project. I turned my back on all of them. I walked across the polished hardwood floor, heading toward the heavy oak doors of the foyer. My heels clicked in a steady rhythm, echoing through the desolate space. I did not look over my shoulder. The night was over, but the real consequences were just beginning. Monday morning was approaching fast. The banks were going to open. The creditors were going to call. The rumors were going to spread through the Boise financial sector faster than a wildfire. They thought tonight was the worst of it. They had no idea what the sunrise was going to bring. The financial ecosystem of Boise, Idaho, is a tight interwoven network. Information travels faster than a wire transfer, especially when it involves the public humiliation of a prominent developer. When the sun rose on Monday morning, the fallout began. The private equity men from Denver did not just walk out of the Silverhawk Country Club. They made phone calls from their hotel suites before their return flights even boarded. They warned their local associates. They flagged Brody as a toxic liability. By 9 o'clock Monday morning, Brody was sitting in his leased downtown office when the first domino tipped over. His business model relied on cross-collateralized loans. He used the equity from one unfinished project to secure the funding for the next. It was a high-wire act that required constant forward momentum. When word spread that the Old Creek Tract acquisition was dead, his primary lender initiated an immediate portfolio review. They discovered the inflated profit projections. They saw the hollow foundation. They pulled his revolving line of credit before noon. The cascade of defaults was mathematical and merciless. You cannot charm an algorithm, and you cannot manipulate a balance sheet. Without fresh capital to pay his subcontractors, Brody faced a dozen mechanics liens by Thursday. The bank froze his operating accounts. The shiny development firm he used to mock my nursery ceased to function in less than 96 hours. The physical dismantling of their lifestyle happened in broad daylight. Madison built her entire social media persona around the aesthetic of effortless wealth. She posted daily videos from her imported marble kitchen, showing off her leased silver sports car in the background. 2 weeks after the birthday gala, a flatbed tow truck backed into her pristine driveway. The driver did not care about her follower count or her designer wardrobe. He had a repossession order. He hooked the silver sports car to the winch and dragged it onto the flatbed. 2 days later, they came for Brody's luxury SUV. Madison stopped posting updates. Her digital world went entirely dark. The 6,000 square foot modern farmhouse was next. They were 3 months behind on the primary mortgage. The bank issued a notice of default. Brody and Madison were forced to pack their designer clothes into cardboard boxes and vacate the premises before the foreclosure became public record. They downsized to a modest beige rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. There were no marble countertops. There was no space for gala gowns. Madison was forced to take a job showing entry-level duplexes just to cover their utility bills. The golden child was reduced to a cautionary tale. My parents fared no better. Richard and Beverly did not lose their house to foreclosure, but they lost something they valued far more. They lost their access. The elite society of Idaho operates on strict, unspoken rules regarding optics. You can be eccentric and you can be ruthless, but you cannot be caught. My parents were exposed in front of the mayor, the city council, and the wealthiest donors in the state. They were revealed to be petty, cruel, and financially incompetent. The country club elite closed ranks and froze them out. It started with the charity boards. Beverly sat on 3 different philanthropic committees. A week after the gala, she received polite formal emails from the board presidents thanking her for her past service and suggesting she step down to focus on her family. She was quietly erased from the letterheads. When she tried to attend her standing Tuesday tennis match, the club manager intercepted her in the lobby. He informed her with a tight professional smile that her court reservation had been given to another member due to a scheduling error. The error was never fixed. Richard experienced the identical freeze-out. The men he used to drink bourbon with in the clubhouse lounge suddenly had urgent meetings whenever he approached their tables. His phone stopped ringing. The gala invitations stopped arriving in the mail. They were exiles in their own city. Then the financial reality breached Richard's walls. He had spent years making terrible speculative investments on failing commercial strip malls. He always relied on Grandma Beatrice's trust fund to cover his margin calls and patch the holes in his sinking portfolio. With the revocable trust dissolved and the assets locked away under my control, Richard had no safety net. The irony was profound. He had mocked me for years, telling his friends I was a drain on his retirement accounts. Now he was the one liquidating his retirement just to keep the lights on. Within a month, Richard was forced to put his own pristine house on the market. He had to hire a rival brokerage firm to list the property because Madison's reputation was too radioactive to attract high-end buyers. I heard about the open house through my foreman. Richard and Beverly had to sit in a coffee shop across town while strangers walked through their manicured living room, opening their closets and judging their furniture. They had to sell the house where they hosted their lavish Thanksgiving dinners, the same house where they placed bets on my failure. They moved into a small generic condominium. Richard traded his tailored tuxedos for cheap golf shirts. He was just another aging man trying to outrun his past. I did not lift a single finger to cause any of this. I did not hire a lawyer to sue them. I did not plant rumors in the local papers. I did not call Brody's creditors. I did not demand the country club revoke their memberships. I simply went back to work. I spent my days at Idaho Native Roots wearing my heavy work boots and my flannel shirts. I managed my crew. I finalized the environmental protections for the Old Creek Tract, ensuring the native wetlands would remain untouched forever. I met with Grandma Beatrice in her study, drinking black tea and mapping out long-term growth strategies for her private portfolio. I watched the house of cards collapse from a safe distance. They built their empire on a foundation of lies, debt, and cruelty. All I did was introduce the truth. The truth carries its own weight. I just let gravity do the work. For 5 years, they derived their power from keeping me small. They bonded over their shared disdain for the charity case. They thought my silence was proof of their superiority. They failed to realize that true power is the ability to walk away, leaving your opponents to fight among themselves in the wreckage they created. But the human ego is a stubborn parasite. It does not die easily. It mutates. When arrogance fails, it pivots to desperation. As the weeks turned into months and the financial pressure crushed the breath out of them, the silence from their end began to break. They realized the money they desperately needed to survive the wealth they believed was their birthright was sitting securely in my bank accounts. They realized the daughter they threw away was the only person who held a life raft. They did not handle the realization with grace. They tried to rewrite the narrative one more time. They thought they could manipulate their way back into my life using the very device that had exposed them in the first place. 6 months passed. The harsh Idaho winter thawed into a brilliant, vibrant spring. I stood in the center of greenhouse number 3, evaluating a fresh crop of native sagebrush and wild lupine. The state municipal contract was operating months ahead of schedule. My crew was in the process of expanding the riverfront restoration footprint by another 12 miles. The humid air inside the glass walls smelled of wet soil and growing roots. My work boots were coated in thick gray mud, and my hands carried the familiar dull ache of hard physical labor. I built my empire in the soil, and the soil was paying dividends. I wiped my hands on my heavy canvas work pants and pulled my cell phone from my front pocket. I needed to check an incoming email from my primary irrigation supplier. When I unlocked the screen, a specific notification caught my eye. It was an alert from my blocked messages folder. The operating system on my phone automatically filtered all communication from restricted numbers, denying them access to my main inbox, but it stored the data in a hidden digital vault just in case the records were needed for legal purposes. I tapped the folder icon. The screen loaded. I scrolled down the list. There were 72 unread text messages and 48 unheard voicemails. All of them originated from 3 specific numbers: Richard, Beverly, Madison. I did not need to listen to the audio files to know exactly what they contained. I could read the preview text on the display. The evolution of their panic was documented in chronological order, providing a clear psychological map of a collapsing hierarchy. In the first few weeks after the gala, the messages were defensive and angry. They demanded immediate meetings. They insisted I owed them a formal face-to-face conversation to sort out what they still called a family misunderstanding. They still believed they held a shred of authority. When the bank foreclosures hit and their country club memberships were officially revoked, the tone shifted entirely. The arrogance evaporated, and the desperate pleading began. I read a text preview from my father sent on a Tuesday afternoon 3 months ago. Nora, we need to talk about family unity. We must put the past behind us and work together. I read another snippet from my mother sent on a Sunday morning. Sweetheart, I am praying for our relationship to heal. Please let me come see the nursery. I miss my daughter. The most recent message was from Madison, sent just 2 days prior. Nora Brody packed his bags and left. I am living alone in a studio apartment. Please pick up the phone. I have no one else to call. They did not miss me. They missed the trust fund. They missed the financial security. They were drowning in the natural consequences of their own vanity, and they wanted me to throw them a life raft. For 34 years, they treated me like a disease they needed to quarantine. They mocked my career and isolated me from their social circles. Now that I held the keys to the kingdom, they suddenly remembered the definition of unconditional love. I want to pause here for a moment. If you are watching this video right now, I want you to look at your screen. I want you to put yourself in my work boots, standing in that humid greenhouse, holding a phone full of apologies from the very people who broke you. If you were in my shoes, would you read those messages? Would you listen to their tearful voicemails and give them a chance to explain their behavior? Or would you leave them on read forever? Drop a comment below right now. Type the word read if you would listen. Type the word delete if you would walk away. I genuinely want to know how you would handle that moment. Let me tell you what I did. I realized something profound standing there in the quiet warmth of the greenhouse. Society constantly conditions us to believe that closure requires a final conversation. We are taught that the high road involves sitting across from our abusers and forcing them to understand our pain. We want the cinematic screaming match. We want them to fall to their knees, validate our suffering, and admit they were wrong. But toxic people do not offer closure. They only offer new traps. Giving them your anger tells them they still possess the power to affect your heart rate. Giving them your forgiveness tells them they can access your resources again. True power is not screaming back at the people who hurt you. True power is the total absence of a reaction. True power is becoming a brick wall. I looked at the 72 unread messages and the 48 unheard voicemails. I did not feel angry. I did not feel vindicated. I just felt tired of carrying their ghosts around in my pocket. I tapped the edit button in the top right corner of the screen. I selected the entire folder. A system prompt appeared asking me to confirm the permanent deletion of 120 files. I pressed confirm. The folder emptied instantly. The screen went blank. I did not listen to a single second of audio. I did not read a single paragraph of their manufactured remorse. I erased their voices from my device and from my mind with a single tap of my finger. I established a permanent, impenetrable boundary. They were no longer my family. They were just strangers I used to know. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Later that week, I drove my truck out to the edge of the city limits. It was Saturday morning. I did not spend my weekends navigating toxic holiday dinners or sitting in sterile country club dining rooms, hiding by the kitchen doors anymore. I spent my weekends at the old creek tract. I parked my truck near the original rusted iron gates. Grandma Beatrice was already there waiting for me. She wore a thick wool sweater and sturdy walking shoes. At 80 years old, her stride was still purposeful and remarkably strong. We walked side by side past the historic red barns Brody had wanted to demolish for scrap wood. We walked through the dense ancient pine forests he had planned to clear cut for tennis courts. We walked all the way down the sloping valley to the edge of the river. The water was cold and clear, cutting a path through the rocky earth just as it had for thousands of years. There were no concrete foundations poured into the banks. There were no paved roads suffocating the meadows. There were no gated subdivisions bearing the name of a failed, arrogant developer. The land was safe. The permanent conservation easement was filed and recognized by the state. The acreage was a protected ecological reserve. It would outlast all of us. Beatrice leaned on her silver-handled cane and looked out over the rolling landscape. She took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. We did not speak about Richard or Beverly. We never mentioned Madison or Brody. We refused to let their failures contaminate our peace. Instead, we talked about the seasonal migration patterns of the local wildlife. We discussed the quarterly dividend yields of her private portfolio. We talked about expanding the boundaries of the reserve. I stood next to the woman who taught me how to read a balance sheet and how to build a fortress. I looked at the vast, untouched wilderness stretching out toward the horizon. I was completely free from the shadows of my past. The charity case they created was dead. I was the architect of my own life. But the story does not simply end with a quiet walk in the woods. The journey of cutting out toxic family members leaves a permanent psychological blueprint. It teaches you brutal lessons about human nature and self-respect that you carry into every room you enter thereafter. I realized I needed to share the final piece of that blueprint. The journey of cutting out toxic family members leaves a permanent psychological blueprint. When you finally sever the cord connecting you to the people who raised you, the world shifts on its axis. You brace yourself for an overwhelming sense of loss. You expect to feel a vast, empty void in your chest. But the void never comes. Instead, you experience an unfamiliar weightlessness. You realize you are not carrying a family. You are carrying an anchor. If you are watching this video right now, I know exactly why you stayed until the end. You recognize your own reflection in my story. You know what it feels like to walk into a holiday dinner and brace yourself for the subtle insults. You know the unique sting of being the punchline to an inside joke you are not allowed to hear. You understand the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to prove your value to people who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding you. For years, they might have called you the black sheep. They might have labeled you the difficult one, the sensitive one, or the failure. When you hear those labels repeated enough times, you start to internalize the narrative. You try to change your behavior to fit their parameters. You attempt to speak softer or dress differently or achieve more. You convince yourself that if you just find the exact right combination of words, they will finally look at you with genuine respect. But respect is not a mathematical equation you can solve. It is a baseline requirement for any healthy relationship. If your family does not offer it freely, no amount of success will ever force their hand. They will always find a reason to move the goalposts. We are constantly conditioned by society to forgive our relatives no matter the cost. We are fed empty platitudes claiming that blood is thicker than water and that family is everything. People will tell you that holding on to distance is unhealthy. They will urge you to answer those desperate voicemails and read those pleading text messages because life is short. They fail to recognize that life is far too short to spend it shrinking yourself to make toxic people comfortable. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it does not require reconciliation. You can forgive someone from a distance and still refuse to grant them access to your life. The absence of a reaction is the ultimate mercy. It is mercy for yourself, and ultimately it is mercy for them, because it forces them to finally face their own reflection without you serving as a distraction. People often ask me if I regret what happened at the Silverhawk Country Club. They assume my actions were driven by a desire for revenge. They think I orchestrated a master plan to bankrupt my father and destroy my brother-in-law. That assumption represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamic. Revenge is a reactionary emotion. Revenge requires a desire to inflict pain. It implies that I still cared about their opinions enough to want to hurt them back. I did not want to hurt my parents or my sister. I just made a conscious decision to stop protecting them from themselves. I stopped absorbing the consequences of their poor choices. I simply handed them the mirror they had been avoiding for decades and let them look at their own reflections. Setting a boundary is not an act of aggression. It is an act of supreme self-respect. It is the precise moment you decide you will no longer serve as collateral damage in someone else's war against their own insecurities. My parents and my sister were profoundly insecure individuals. They constructed their entire identities around external validation. They needed a scapegoat because without someone to look down on, they would be forced to examine the hollow reality of their own lives. Their arrogance was just a loud, desperate cover for their quiet terror. I did not destroy their family structure. I simply resigned from my mandatory position as their emotional punching bag. Once I removed myself from their equation, their fragile ecosystem collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction. My sister Madison spent her entire life trying to be the golden child. She chased my parents' approval like a drug, and it left her empty and over-leveraged. She won the popularity contest in a family that was destined to fail. Do not envy the golden child. Their pedestal is just another type of cage. Be grateful for the shadows. The shadows are where you learn how to survive. The shadows are where you learn how to see in the dark. When I look back at that night in the ballroom, I do not remember the anger. I remember the stark contrast between their world and mine. Their world was entirely synthetic. It was constructed of leased cars, imported marble, and forced smiles. It required constant, frantic maintenance just to keep up appearances. My world was organic. It required calloused hands and muddy work boots, but it was real. When you build something real, nobody can take it away from you. A public humiliation cannot repossess a native plant nursery. A severed family tie cannot alter the terms of a municipal state contract. When your foundation is solid, the opinions of people who only value the superficial simply bounce off you like rain against a glass greenhouse. The true surprise, the real twist in my story, was not the transfer of the family trust fund. Money is just numbers on a ledger. Wealth can be gained and lost in a single afternoon, as my father learned the hard way. The actual victory was realizing that the currency my family traded in was entirely worthless. They spent their lives chasing country club memberships, designer labels, and the fleeting approval of wealthy strangers. They built a beautiful glass house on a foundation of sand. I chose a different path. I chose to build my empire in the dirt. I chose to cultivate roots that could withstand a brutal winter. I traded the illusion of status for the quiet, undeniable reality of ownership. If you are the one they currently mock, let them laugh. If you are the one they constantly underestimate, use their ignorance as your camouflage. Let them believe you are weak while you quietly gather your strength. Do not waste your energy arguing with people who are determined to see you lose. Do not beg for a seat at a table where you are served nothing but disrespect. Build your own table. Build it out of sturdy wood and set it wherever you choose. And when the time comes, you do not need to scream your success from the rooftops. You just let the facts speak for themselves. The truth does not need a microphone to be heard. It carries its own weight. Today, I spend my time exactly where I want to be. I do not navigate toxic holiday dinners or endure condescending lectures. I stand on the edge of the old creek tract, breathing in the cold, clean air of the Idaho wilderness. The 500 acres of native pine forests and winding riverfront are safe. The historic red barns still stand holding the memories of my great-grandfather. The wild meadows are free from concrete and asphalt. The land is a protected ecological reserve, secured for generations to come. It is a living, breathing testament to the power of holding your ground. I am no longer the charity case. I am Nora Robinson, and I am exactly where I belong. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If my story resonated with your own experiences, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Hitting that notification bell ensures you will not miss the next story. Drop a comment below sharing how you learned to set your own boundaries. I read every single one of your comments and I honor your courage. Keep building your empire in the dirt, and I will see you in the next video. I stand on the edge of the old creek track today, a 70-year-old woman listening to the cold river cut its path through the stone. It has been 46 years since that night in the Silverhawk Ballroom when I was just 24. I am no longer the young woman they called a charity case. I am the architect of my own peace. Looking back at the financial and social wreckage of my family's illusions, I see the clear blueprint of my survival. It took decades to fully process the shift from being a discarded daughter to becoming the matriarch of my own life. Over the last 4.5 decades, I distilled that experience into 5 distinct lessons. If you are walking a similar path right now, surviving a dynamic that insists on misunderstanding you, I want to share what a lifetime of distance has taught me. First, your worth is never determined by people who refuse to see it. At 24, they judged me by the mud on my work boots while I was quietly securing my future. You must remember that the strongest foundations are built in the dirt. Do not internalize their blindness. Second, true power is the total absence of a reaction. Society tells us to fight back, to scream our truth until our abusers hear us. But toxic individuals only use your anger as fuel for their narrative. When I deleted those voicemail messages all those years ago, I learned that walking away in total permanent silence is the ultimate checkmate. Third setting. A boundary is an act of supreme self-respect, not an act of revenge. You are not destroying a family by stepping away. You are simply refusing to serve as collateral damage in their quiet war against their own insecurities. You owe no one access to your peace. Fourth, real wealth is organic and grounded. A life constructed on highly leveraged loans, country club memberships, and the fleeting approval of strangers is a fragile glass house waiting to shatter. Cultivate deep roots that can withstand a brutal winter. Authenticity will always outlast a fake aesthetic. Fifth, forgiveness does not require reconciliation. Over the decades, I learned to forgive them from a safe distance, so I no longer carried their heavy ghosts in my pocket. But I never handed them the keys to my front door ever again. Mercy does not mean submission. The 500 acres of ancient pine forests and winding riverfront behind me are safe forever, and so am I. I spent my life far away from people who built their identities on debt and lies. I am Nora Robinson, and I built my empire in the dirt. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If my story resonated with your own experiences, please hit the like button and subscribe. This is Hazel Tells Stories, and I read every single comment you leave. Drop a comment below sharing how you learned to set your own boundaries. Keep building your empire, and I will see you in the next video.